Welcome back to the Canadian Virtual Sell Your Business Conference. My name is Mark Palaish. I'm president of TorontoJobs.ca, and happy to be joined once again by Doug Robbins, who's president and founder of Robbinex Inc. Doug, you've always got some great information and lots of great takeaways, I'm sure, for this topic as well, problem solving acquisition. So looking forward to hearing. Thanks for being on, and thanks for sponsoring this event as well. And turn it back over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much. One of the things really interesting is people seem to think that buying a business is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, kind of like buying a house. You call your realtor, you look around a few homes, you put an offer in, your lawyer closes a deal, and maybe your bank gets involved and lends you a little bit of money or a mortgage. But buying a business isn't like buying a house. It's just a totally different world. What's really interesting about that is as we started to get involved in representing buyers on occasion, we found that we needed to take a consultative approach to buying a business rather than just, I'm going to buy a business, okay, knock on some doors and see who wants to sell. One of the things we learned in doing this was that 67% of the businesses that are acquired by other businesses within 2 to 2.5 or even 3 years fail to meet the expectations that the purchaser had for the business that he bought. And that's pretty serious. They may not be failing, but they didn't meet the expectations. So what are we doing here that's maybe not right? So if you could take and look a little bit into the future, how would you see your business evolving? I mean, where do you want your business to be in 5 years? At Robbinex, we use a program called 10-5-3 strategic planning. And that's where we sit down and we say to our client, okay, what do you want to be doing in 10 years? What does your business need to be doing in 10 years if you want to do what you want to do in 10 years? And notice the subtle differences. There's a requirement for yourself personally and a requirement for the business. So what goals do we need to achieve in 5 years if we ever expect to reach our vision of 10? And we better do some strategic planning for the next 3 years if we ever hope to meet the 5-year goals, to meet the 10-year visions. And so when you sit back and ponder on this kind of stuff, you're really into some strategic planning. What it's really doing is you're now changing the value of your business. I'm a firm believer that most businesses can double in value at least every 5 years. So if your business is worth $1 million today, that means in 5 years it should be worth $2 million. I'm wondering about that. How are we going to do that? Well, this pretty interesting exercise in thinking through the logistics of what we're going to do. An acquisition can make some significant changes, and you'll hear about a couple of acquisitions we went through towards the end of this presentation and how dramatic they can be. But one of the things we really need to do is we need to take a look at the complexity of buying a business. And this is what we call our transition roadmap. And you won't be able to read the points on here, they're too small, but you'll see a bunch of figures on the sides in red, and these are people that are involved in different aspects of the transaction. And the complexity is really surprising. We closed the transaction a number of years ago down in Port Colborne, and it was a small machining business doing about $4.5–5 million a year in sales. And the due diligence checklist that the purchaser came to the table with was 982 items long. 982 items long. I mean, wow. So what's also interesting about this complexity is it takes a lot of time. Our average transaction is about 600 to 800 working hours. That's almost a half a year, full time. Think about it. The amount of information that we're going to consume and need to understand and fit together takes a lot of time. So we've sort of broken this down into some steps. The first step is we start conducting research and do analysis to create what we might look at as a strategic acquisition model. What are we going to try to accomplish if we're making an acquisition? So as we think about that, we really need to get into our own business in great depth. We're going to grow our business through acquisition. Then the second thing we need to do is develop an acquisition strategy based on what we've learned when we did our research and our analysis. And that's pretty simple if you think about it. And step 3 is really simple. We just need to execute. Step 2, and in effect, based on what step one does. But what's really fascinating in our world is everybody's really busy, and most folks are way too busy to do the first step. So if they haven't done the first step, then step two is kind of a shot in the dark, and step three is ready, shoot, aim. Oh, we forgot to aim first. And this is a big deficiency. This is why so many of those businesses, that 67% I spoke about at the beginning, fail to meet the expectations of the purchaser involved. So as we started looking at it, we created a program we call the 3 E's. Pretty straightforward: evaluate and analyze, effective planning, and execution. We use this program for existing businesses before they do an acquisition, before they do any kind of serious growth planning. Let's understand where we've been and where we're going and where we are right now. So we look at where we've been, then we look at where we are, then we move into the second E and we start planning. And the plan has to be realistic, obviously, so we can execute. So the execution is going to work. So step one is the past and the present. And as we look at that, we then start planning towards the future. So let's look at this in some more detail. Step one, as we're researching our business and we want to really understand our client's business, if he's going to do an acquisition, we need to know how well they're doing within their industry standard. What's the industry's opportunities? What's the industry's pitfalls and problems? How much competition is there? How serious is the competition? Is it minor? Is it aggressive? How's technology impacting our businesses? What's the pandemic done to our business, and what will it do to our industry? So you can see there's an awful lot of stuff that we need to take a quick look at, industry-wide, from the 10,000-foot view perspective. Then we need to crawl down a little lower and get right into the business itself. What is our client's business doing? How well is it performing? Is it consistent? Is it bouncing? Are their customers reliable? Do we have customer concentration? Do we have supplier concentration? Do we have employee issues? There's over 50 different items that we look at when we're looking at a client's business to make the decision how we're going to perform in the future. So from there, we do a SWOT analysis, and that's pretty straightforward: the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of the client's business. But what's really interesting is the SWOT, the SW part of it, the strengths and the weaknesses. The client can deal with those. He can fix them. If he's got a weakness, he can strengthen. If he's got a problem, he can capitalize on it. But the opportunities and threats come from areas he can't control: economy, government regulation, those kinds of things. So we need to be aware of those things and how we can work within our own skill sets to deal with them. And as we're starting to get this picture, and it doesn't happen overnight, we're in the months of work. As we start to get this picture, we can start to develop, what's going on here? Sorry. We can start to develop the vision and the growth strategy and some financial projections that we think can be achieved. Pretty straightforward if you think about it when you do it in steps, but if you don't do the first step, all the rest of the stuff doesn't work very well. So as you're developing your vision and your growth strategy, then you can sit down and say, wow, what kind of business should I buy to achieve my goals and objectives? What criteria do they have to have? So it's a process. Step two, as we start moving forward, is to identify potential target companies. And there's thousands and thousands of companies out there. Many times there's a really good company for you that you haven't even thought about. It's off to the side. It's not in the limelight. It may not even be a competitor to you. It could be a supplier. It could have a product line. We got involved a number of years ago with a situation where my client had a proprietary product, but he was only selling it in a 300-mile radius of his operation. We suggested he should expand his market, if you will, geographically, and see if we could double it, make it 600-mile radius. Instead of just taking in Toronto and Ottawa and London and all the cities in Ontario, it would expand to take in Montreal, Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, New York. Like it really made a huge difference. So as he started that expansion, somebody came and knocked on his door and said, I'd like to buy your company. And they made him a particularly good offer. It was more than the company would have valued at. But as we talked to this purchaser, we found that he had a market area that was probably about 1,500-mile radii. So he was going to take my client's product and sell it through his distribution center. So on the strength of that, we went looking for other purchasers who were in the similar business, who had a larger territory. And we found a purchaser who covered the world and sold similar products, not a product of a client, but similar products, throughout the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe, South America. And their potential for the business was really huge. They came back and said, we can increase the sales of this business about tenfold. And they paid appropriately for it. So the purchaser knew his capabilities. He knew his weaknesses. In this particular case, this large company had a weakness that wasn't evident, but they didn't have the product line that my client had. And so when you sit down and look at what you're trying to do when you're doing an acquisition, you need to have a vision. The purchaser for this company wasn't looking to buy my client's company. Didn't even know it existed, quite frankly. But they'd done all their homework. They knew themselves inside out and backwards, and they knew an opportunity when they saw it, and they were able to move on it very quickly. And when I say quickly, they bought and closed that business inside of 90 days. So approaching those and qualifying those targets is the next thing. We need to understand, do they really fit? So as a rule of thumb, we would probably identify 100 companies when we're starting to do this kind of work. But we're not going to buy 100 companies. So we've identified 100 companies and we start qualifying. We'll do Google researches on them. We'll pull credit checks on them. And we'll do some background checks on them and start to talk within the industry about some of the products that we need to deal with. So we get a handle on what the opportunity is of what we're looking at. Now, one of the most important things we need to do is if we're going to buy a business, we need to develop a trusting relationship with that seller. He's got to believe in us. He's got to know that we're honest, integrous, we're people of our word. We do what we say we're going to do when we say we're going to do it. And this is really important to the purchaser because when he buys the business from the seller, the relationship with that seller after the transaction could determine whether or not he gets to buy another business from somebody else, because people may call the seller and say, what was your deal like? Were the people honest? Were they straightforward? Do they have integrity? And if that seller is not happy with the way the deal came together, you've got a problem. So we need to make sure we've got this trusting relationship with the seller right at the beginning. When we're talking to these people, we start with an NDA right before we do anything except maybe say our name. Hi, I'm Doug Robbins with Robbinex, and we got a client would like to talk to you about doing something together. And just to put your mind at ease, here's a confidentiality agreement. Everything we talk about, this stays between us. And as we start collecting the target's information, we're going to get it fairly general at the beginning. We don't want to get into the nitty gritty at the beginning. We want to find out if it's the best target for us. So as we start researching, analyzing those targets, we're going to take and put this into a graph. You'll see in a minute. I'm bringing a little technical problem here, guys. Yeah. So we're going to do preliminary due diligence. And due diligence is really huge. Now, if you want to go in and do the 982 item due diligence list in every target you're looking at, you'll never buy a business because you'll be too busy doing due diligence. So you need to cut that thing back into categories. Maybe there's 15 items of preliminary information you want will help make you make the decision as to whether to proceed. And then we're going to value the target. And I call this the napkin valuation because it's not the real valuation. But based on the limited information we collected in the preliminary due diligence from our research, from talking to the client, to the target, well, we should have a pencil value that's reasonably close. So if we're valuing the business at maybe $100, do we have the $100 to buy the business? Because if we only got $50 and we think it's worth $100, then maybe this company doesn't fit with our target. We did a transaction, about to do a transaction in Burlington a number of years ago, and the purchaser had identified the targets. Man, I want to buy this business, rah, 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 rah. He came along, he did all the things he thought he needed to do. He put in a letter of intent. He got it accepted. He got due diligence done by his accounting firm. His lawyer wrote an 80-page agreement of purchase and sale, and the bank wouldn't finance him to do the acquisition. So he spent a lot of legal fees, a lot of accounting fees, a lot of professional fees, search fees. It was all a waste. He hadn't done a thorough job of his own operation to know how much money he had available to make an acquisition and how much the bank was going to support him. All right, but this little technical problem in the PowerPoint, we don't have in the rest of these slides. So I like to take and quantify the seller's interest with what I call a memorandum of understanding, an MOU. I like to keep it simple. In English, 2-3 pages, the price is, the amount cash paid, the amount of deferred payment, whether it's a note or maybe it's a lease, maybe it's an earn-out, maybe it's a royalty payment, maybe it's a management consulting agreement. What's up front in cash and what's deferred? What do we expect from the seller? Do we expect them not to compete? Do we want them to work for a while? What are we looking for? Nice and simple, written in English that everybody can understand, and of course not binding. And when you get to that point, now you're in a position to really start doing something serious with the business. You should have a virtual data room, and they're relatively available all over. You can buy one for about $1,000 to load up your information. And you want that so that you can make the information available to your entire team within your own company, your professionals, your lawyer, your accountant, maybe your private equity group if you're financing that way, or your banker. And that's really important. We pull that together properly. It just facilitates doing the due diligence work. Now, one of the things that I think is really important when doing the due diligence work is to take a look at the financial statements. Of course, I want to see the statements. And most people look at the top line and look at the bottom line. They look at 5 years top line, 5 years bottom line. Ho-hum, this is great. But I don't think that's good enough. What I like to do is look at the ratios. So we'll just go back a slide here for a second. And we have the actual figures. In one column beside it, we have that percentage of revenue that represents whatever the thing is. For example, I don't know if you can read that or not, but the first line says administration fees, $415,000 was 3.57%. I want to see the percentages. My thing's frozen, Chris. We're frozen here. I can't move it. Oh, there we are. Okay. So all I'm looking at now is the ratio table. That's all I want to see is just the ratios. And then I want to compare the ratios. Come on. So if we look at this ratio, look at the administration fees. 5 years ago, the administration fees were 0.75%. Now they're 3.57%. Boy, that brings a lot of questions up, doesn't it? What's happening here? Advertising promotion went from 0.87% of revenue to only 0.05%. Boy, there's got to be a story. What's going on? So I'm trying to learn what's going on. Look at the insurance costs. They've dropped in half. Why did insurance drop in half? Normally it goes up, and so on and so forth. So you start looking at the numbers, and there's big differences. The profit used to be 18% of sales. Now it's only 13% of sales. I mean, operating expenses. So there's big changes going on in this business. And this is the kind of thing you need to drill down when you're doing your preliminary analysis, even if you can get the financial statements before you put your letter of intent in or your MOU in. And this is the kind of stuff that I like to look at. So then we want to oversee the contracts and drafting that your lawyer is going to do. So you got the MOU in place. You've started to do your due diligence, and your lawyer is going to write the contract. And I'm sure there's a few lawyers listening in here, and I'm going to tell you something. In my experience, and most lawyers are practicing law they're not expert in. Okay, and I don't mean to be negative here, but I'll give you an example. We had a transaction we closed a couple of years ago for a little over $10 million, so it was a mid-sized transaction. And the buyer's lawyer was a young guy, about 34, 35 years old. That's young to me, by the way. And he was really excited about doing this thing. He said, man, I'm going to write the perfect agreement, and there won't be any changes on it. I guarantee you there won't be any changes on it. And he said, fine. He delivered an 82-page agreement of purchase and sale. A lot of thought went into it. Spent a lot of time writing it. It went to a downtown law firm in Toronto who made 815 changes to that document. I can tell you the legal fees in that transaction went right off the wall. We had another transaction. We sold the business down in Chatham years ago, and the purchaser's lawyer was from Windsor. And we had a $100,000 deposit on the transaction on our memorandum of understanding. And the agreement of purchase and sale came in. It didn't follow the process. It was supposed to come to us for review, but it went directly to the seller's lawyer. About 3 days later, the seller called up, said, "Doug, there's no deal here. Give the buyer his deposit back." And I said, "Why? What's wrong?" He said, "You should see the agreement this lawyer wrote up, and our lawyer said it'll never close. We're wasting everybody's time." I said, "Well, the price was right, is it not?" He said, "We agreed on the price. You haven't changed your mind on the price?" "No, and the amount of cash you're getting is right. And all the things we talked about, you still want to do the deal." He said, "Send me that contract." Make a long story short, the purchaser's lawyer was a real estate lawyer, and he'd never done a transaction like this before where he bought shares of a company. And so he'd gone to the law library, got an agreement of purchase and sale, and filled in the blanks. The problem was he picked up an agreement that was used to buy and sell a publicly traded company. That's more interest to the transaction. The seller's lawyer specialized in family law, particularly in divorces. And in fact, he was going through a divorce himself, and so he was pretty emotional about it. He'd never seen a formal agreement like this and didn't know what he was talking about. We brought in a third law firm to teach the two lawyers how to do a business transaction, so we closed the transaction. So you can see that there's an awful lot of complexity that we talked about earlier in these transactions, just with the lawyers themselves. So I say to most lawyers, most buyers, make sure your lawyer is capable of doing what needs to be done. And I say to the seller, let's make sure your lawyer knows what he's doing. And it's surprising how many lawyers are specialized, but not in selling and buying businesses. Financing the transaction. Wow, you really need to get that in together before you even start this process, because if you haven't got the bucks, then you're not going to close the deal. Okay, or you're going to stand in your ear trying to close the deal. And we had a transaction we tried to close recently in St. Catharines. And the purchaser came to us, and on the surface looked like he had all the money. The banker said, "Yeah, we're going to support him." Well, the support the bank offered him was a lot different than the support we were led to believe the bank was going to give him. And the net result was the transaction didn't close. Both parties had quite a bit of cost incurred for legal fees. Facilitating the closing process is another step. You got to make sure that all the bits and pieces are together as you're going to close your transaction. And then you need what we call post-closing reconciliation. This is really an important piece here, because invariably there's things to be adjusted after a transaction closes. There's some bad debt that didn't get collected, or there's inventory that's not going to get sold, or the receivables were higher than anticipated, so there's some money owed to the seller. And at the end of the day, usually in 90 days, there's a price adjustment clause goes on, and there's a check written between the seller and the buyer to balance the accounts. And then invariably after the closing, if there's deferred payments, and usually there are they paid on a timely basis, and is everybody happy? And this is really important. In fact, that trusting relationship we talked about at the beginning. If the buyer's got high level of integrity and all the post-closing reconciliations done above board and with confidence, then that seller's going to recommend his friends and maybe even some of his competitors come and talk to you to make another acquisition. The acquisition search process is quite complex, as we're starting to figure out. This is a little worksheet that we use, kind of the milestones we're going to go through and the estimated hours we're going to spend. On the first one is to understand industry trends and forecasted growth rates within an industry. We got some databases we can use for that. We run something from Ibis World, or we may go to SageWorks, or you can stuff from Robert Morris. There's lots of different places where you can get the industry trends and forecast growth. Sometimes your banker can provide you with that stuff too. Your accounting firm should be able to as well. So you need to look at that. Then you look at the competition and so on and so forth to go through this list. Our average time to do one of these transactions is quite long. You can see just on the bottom here, if you can read on your screen, somewhere between 400 and 1,000 hours. I mean, there's a lot of time that goes in one of these projects. As I mentioned earlier, our average time is about 625 hours. But what's also interesting is each of these three phases that we go through are done at different stages in the timeline. So the working hours might only be 600 or 700 hours, but it's over maybe 12 or 15 months. We say to the average client, look, it takes 3 to 6 months to find a target. It takes 3 to 4 months to go through all the negotiations and analysis and the due diligence, and it takes another couple or 3 months to close the transaction. You're looking at 12 to 15 months. If you think you're going to do it more quickly, you're in for a surprise. And I think that's really important to understand, that this is not an instant process. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. So one of the things you're going to do, as we talked about earlier, you need to learn and evaluate the client's business. You want to do a CASETA and a SWOT analysis, comprehensive strategic analysis of transition alternatives. You want to understand where that seller is and where he's going to go. And when SWOT analysis on his business, its strengths and weaknesses, its opportunities, its threats. So understand what this business is all about. So we've done our own on ourselves. Now we're going to do it on the business that we're looking at buying. Now comes the fun part. We need to understand what motivates the seller, their goals and aspirations. What keeps them up at night? What wakes them up at 4 o'clock in the morning? What's the biggest problem they got? If they could wave a magic wand, what would they change? Does the business strategically fit with your business, or is it off to the side and it doesn't really fit at all? Where is the real synergy? Are we going to be able to buy more product and get a lower price because of volume? We're going to sell more product to more customers because we'll get more, we'll find ourselves a bit more customers. Are we going to have an opportunity to reduce the employment level in the company that we're buying because we can do the work internally at almost no extra cost? Do we need their location? Maybe we can shut their location down and move into our location. Maybe we can close our location, move into their location. So there's a lot of opportunity here that we need to really understand where the synergy is, and we're going to do it. Now, what about the industry itself? Every industry has its own set of challenges, and today's world with COVID is creating lots of challenges nobody ever thought about. In fact, in my business, one example is pretty interesting. We located our business halfway between Buffalo and Toronto because I do a lot of travel, and it's just as easy to fly out of Buffalo as it is out of Toronto. And I used to think nothing of hopping a plane, flying down to Chicago for lunch or into New York for some meetings and come back the next morning, or Boston. And it was just the way it was. I can tell you that today I'm not going to be doing much flying. When the restrictions are relieved and we go back to some form of normal, it's a lot easier just to zoom into whoever I want to talk to for half an hour or 45 minutes, and just to hop a plane, fly down, and do all the travel costs and all that stuff. So we're going to see some significant changes even in Robbinex in the next little while. Our software is far more sophisticated today than it was 2 years ago. So those changes are affecting your business, and you need to understand what they are. Then you need to create a financial model. Your business, the business you're buying, and then the businesses together. And that really tells you a lot about, is this really what you want to do? So once you've got that structure, that sense, that vision, then you start developing your acquisition strategy. You create the business plan to execute the strategy, and you develop your target lists. You execute. Okay, and then you start to make it work. And you can see the timelines again, how this time takes weeks. This little process just doesn't happen overnight. It takes a bit of time. So we want to identify the targets by location and their size. This is pretty meticulous work. You can have a researcher work on this for weeks at a time. Then you want to work on that strategy we spoke about. And then you want to start talking to those targets. And you want to quantify and qualify those targets. So as you're starting to collect your information, as you're going through all these different steps, you want to put it on a chart. Client 1, client 2, client 3, and so on. And maybe you got 10 clients and not 6. You need a bigger chart. But now you put down the estimated revenue. How many employees did you think you have? How long they've been around? What kind of work do they do? And as you start to fill in the blanks, and you sit back and you look at 4 or 5 or 6 companies to fill in the blanks, 1 or 2 is going to jump off the page to be the one you really want to buy. Almost sounds simple. And it is simple if you do the work. And now we start running into some other challenges. You pick up the phone, you call somebody, say, hey, you want to sell your business? The answer is, my business ain't for sale. Challenge number 2. You call up somebody, say, I want to buy your business. All they see is dollar signs in their eyes. Okay. And if you think about that, they probably have got unrealistic expectations. What I'm going to tell you is 80%. In fact, there was a study just done by BDC, Business Development Bank, and they learned that of all the clients they had over 55 years of age, 80% of them had not even thought about selling their business or having an exit strategy or turning it over to the next generation or doing an MBO. They had no thought at all about what they're going to do with their business. Okay, so that creates a new set of problems. They're too busy. They're so busy doing their thing they haven't really thought about it. No time to think about it now. I ain't got time. Call me back in 5 years. 5-year syndrome is a real serious syndrome. We run into it all the time. Because when the client says, well, I think maybe I should talk about selling my business, that they're thinking about the things that they need to think about. And as they start thinking about the things they need to think about, they say, oh my God, call me in 5 years. Okay, they haven't got time to think about it. They're too busy. What's really upsetting about that, and what's really a concern about that, is they haven't thought about the most important thing, is life after business. One of the things I like to say to an owner of a business was, when you started your business, how long did you plan to be in it? And what was your expectations for that business in terms of sales, profit, its value? What were you going to do when it's done? When would it be done? And they all have an answer from when they started, but time's gone by. They've passed the timeline they were going to be in the business. They've doubled or tripled or fourfolded the revenue thought they were going to get. They made more money than they'll ever spend. And they haven't thought about what they're going to do with the rest of their life. They've got no exit strategy. They've got no life after business plan. We had a client come to us a bunch of years ago and he said, hey, we'd like to turn our business over to our daughters. Can you help us? Well, sure. So we went in and met the family, did a valuation on the business, and the daughters were 21 and 23. The business employed 80 people. The daughters, one was a receptionist and one was doing accounts payable payments. They had no concept of how to run the business, but mom and dad were bound and determined they're going to give the business over to their daughters. The business wasn't making any money either. What's another little issue. So we brought a psychologist in who interviewed the daughters and interviewed the family and come back and said, look, these daughters really aren't ready to take over business at this point in time. You'd be doing a terrible disservice to your daughters and your family because they'll probably fail. You need to sell the business or fix it. Ideally, you should fix it. So to make a long story short, they asked us to help fix it. And we did. We put a team in there. It was a full-time team of 2 people for about 6 months. And at the end of that period of time, we had an offer in the business for $7.1 million. Now, if you heard what I said at the beginning, this business wasn't making money when we started. That means there wasn't much value in it. But when we got it turned around and was now making some money, its value went way up. We sold it for $7.1 million. Closed the deal in November, the first part of November. Just before Christmas, I got a call from the wife, and she said, I don't tell you this, my husband's in the hospital. I thought, oh my gosh, what's happened? I'm thinking a heart attack, a stroke. She said, no, he tried to commit suicide. What do you say? Was there anything we can do? No, he's got good care, blah, 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 blah. So we sort of kind of quasi kept in touch. But I got a call from the psychiatrist at the Toronto General Hospital about 6 weeks after that. He said, can we talk to you about this particular patient? I'd like to understand something. So we chatted for about 10 minutes, and he asked us what our role was, what we did, and then we explained it to him. And he said, fine. He said, just as I suspected, your firm was a catalyst for his attempted suicide. Wait a minute. We solved the big problem. We fixed the business. We sold it. We put a lot of money in it. How could we be held responsible for his attempted suicide? And the answer came back was, well, you failed to take and provide something for him to do when the business was sold. The purchaser took over the business, sent him on his way, and he wasn't needed anymore. And this is a man who worked about 80 hours a week in his business, believe it or not. 11, 12, 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. And all of his social connections were either his family, his wife and kids, or his suppliers, his customers, his employees, and even some of his competitors. And so you took all that away when you sold the business and you didn't replace it with anything. He started to get depressed. He started drinking. He became more depressed, and he said, "Oh, what the heck? I don't want to live anymore." So anyway, the good news is we helped him buy another small business and got him busy again. And we now have a real strong program. If somebody's leaving their business, what is their life after business plan? And if they don't have one, we're going to try to create it. And as a buyer for a business, this is an opportunity for you to do the right thing for the seller. Give him something to do. One of my favorite programs is what I call the 5-year consulting contract. And we say to the seller, "We'd like you to stick around for 5 years." "Well, I'm going to do that. I'll keep the business." "Well, no. You don't understand. I'd like you to work full time for 90 days and show the buyer where all the light switches are. Then I'd like you to work part-time for 90 days, walk behind and make sure you didn't forget where the light switches are. And then be available from time to time for the next 4.5 years and become the ambassador for the company. Go to the conferences, the seminars, the workshops, the conventions, and maybe deal with the odd major customer. Get in there 4 or 5 hours a week and do something for the client. And maybe some weeks you got a couple other things to do, and set up a management contract for that. And that allows the seller to gradually go out of his business and not go cold turkey. And that's really important when you're doing an acquisition. If he thinks he's going to go cold turkey, he's not going to sell his business, and you're not going to buy it. If that makes sense. So now we're back into the psychological aspects of this. And if they're procrastinating, they're going to start looking for alternatives. And there's a lot of alternatives. Some of the things they're concerned about. We've talked about these already. Confidentiality, no life after business. There are alternatives to selling. And we got into a brainstorming session with one client. We came up with 31 alternatives to selling his business. And these emotions plays a huge role, So we like to do this nice and soft. We like to say to the client, "Hey, can we chat? We'd like to see if there's some way that our client, our buyer, and you can do business together, or you can do this yourself." What the goal there is to start to develop a trusting relationship. That he kind of likes you, there's opportunity. So in learning a little bit about the guy, try to understand his goals and aspirations. One of my favorite questions of a guy who's been in business 25 or 30 or 35 years is, "Hey, if you were 20 years younger, what changes would you make in the business?" All of a sudden, you'll get dumped on some great opportunities. What are his problems? What are his needs? What keeps him awake at night? Understanding these issues allows you to develop a presentation that's going to address these issues, which makes it easier for the buyer or the seller to say, "Yes, I want to sell my business." Pretty simple. What's really interesting, it may not be an outright acquisition. It could be a partial acquisition or investment. Maybe you just buy a division of his company, or you buy it out over time, maybe over a 5-year program. Maybe you recapitalize it and put some capital into the company and become a silent investor. Maybe you can buy out his partner and take the place of that partner. A lot of businesses have partnership issues. You can do a joint venture where you get together with the buyer, with the seller, you incorporate a new company, and that new company does something for you to do together. Probably buy him out in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. The strategic alliance where you agree to sell some of his products to your customers, or he agrees to sell some of your products to his customers. Then all of a sudden you're now working together. Create a vendor or customer relationship. Maybe you're buying your widgets at half the price he's buying his widgets at because he doesn't buy very many. And maybe you can take and sell to him. Think about the opportunities that are starting to flow to this because you're developing these trusting relationships, as we've talked about. So my feeling here is you need to become creative and flexible in doing your acquisition. It doesn't necessarily need to be an outright acquisition today. It may be 5 years down the road, but it's done over time. It's done in a specific way. Keeping in mind that this all takes a lot of time. You got to plan 6 to 18 months. The fastest deal I ever did, I sold a Cadillac dealership in Chicago. And the client was 82 years old, and we went in and we did our work up front. It took us about, 4 or 5 weeks to do all the work up front. I met with him on a Tuesday morning. We went and had lunch. At 1 o'clock that afternoon, he said, "Great, sell my business," signed all the documents, give us the authority to sell his business. Got a call out of left field about 1:45 from my office saying there was a guy in Chicago wanted to buy the Cadillac dealership that you were visiting. I thought, who in the hell in Chicago would know that I was visiting a Cadillac dealership? So we chased the guy up. Turned out it was a Chrysler dealership down the street. And the head mechanic at the Chrysler dealership's brother was a head mechanic at the Cadillac dealership, and the 82-year-old client was telling everybody he's getting ready to sell the business. So the mechanic told his brother, who told the Chrysler dealer, who made a couple of phone calls, found out it was us that was involved. Anyway, make a long story short, I had an offer at 5 o'clock that night. Wow, that was a fast deal, right? No, it took 9 months to close the deal. There were all kinds of issues that came up, and I won't get into the mechanics of it, but you got to understand that these things just don't happen, and you got to budget for it. It can easily take 2, 3, 4 years. Easy. Remember this chart we showed at the beginning? The roadmap? Target says, yeah, I'm interested. Then you do your analysis and your qualifications. Then you pull your professionals in, and they start to challenge the information that you're given. You do your due diligence in depth, and your objective is met, you close the transaction. Pretty simple. Keep it in that territory, but look at how complex that chart is. Remember, we talked about all the different areas of specialties. It's not uncommon to have 8 or 9 or 10 experts looking at different aspects of the business you're looking at buying. If you're buying a simple business like a hamburger stand, it's not that complicated, but you're buying a manufacturing firm, and you got all kinds of stuff. We sold a manufacturing firm down east of Toronto a bunch of years ago. It was doing about 12 million in sales. In about 3 days before closing, we ran into a problem in the due diligence, and it turned out on the back of one of the purchase orders from a major customer was the right to cancel all his orders if there was a change of control in the company. I'd never seen that on a purchase order before. So you never know where you're going to get hit. So you really need to drill down and understand everything. So the last step is you implement your strategy, and it can also be completed in phases based on the client's needs. So it's not a complex issue, but it's a complex issue. If you cut it up into little pieces and put it into a sequence, it can flow fairly smoothly. I'd like to walk you through another issue that we've been through. My wife was a florist. What's going on here? And she bought a flower shop in 1975. Small flower shop in downtown Hamilton, right at the corner of King and James. It was doing about $200,000 a year in sales. By the way, that's in 1975. So move the decimal almost once, so close to $2 million in today's dollars. So it was a busy shop. It had been there a long time. In fact, it had been there over 75 years. However, the property was owned by one of the chartered banks, and the building was old and pretty tired, but it was operating, and the bank said, well, we don't have any plans to tear the building down right now, but maybe in 4 or 5 years, we're going to tear the building down, and you'll have to move. Well, that was good enough for Marie. She said, great, let's close the deal. So when we look at the flower business, it's a pretty complex business, actually. It's process and manufacturing. They bring in raw material, they assemble it in the flower arrangements and do all the wonderful things they do. Their accounting system is the most complex I've ever seen for small business. They do cash and receivables and credit cards, intercity cards, world transactions. The florists have their own currency called florins when they transfer flowers from one city to another or one country to another. They have all the advertising and marketing issues that most small businesses have. They got personnel challenges coming out of their ears. They sell business to business. They sell retail. They sell wholesale. They sell to consumers. And they got seasonal issues that will just shake the living daylights out of you. You know, the best month of the year is December, and actually their whole year's profits made the 2 weeks of Christmas time. They lose money in January. They kind of break even in February. They do well at Valentine's Day, but they lose money the rest of the month. March is not so good. April's not bad, with Easter a little bit. Mother's Day is a great month. June's so-so. July's lose. August lose. September make a bit of money with weddings. October sort of breaks even because of Thanksgiving. November is a so-so month. So at the end of the year, when you look at their P&L statements, all the profit was made in that 2 weeks before Christmas. Really interesting. Now, Florist has 4 departments, much like most businesses. They got a production department, a sales department, an accounting department, and an inventory and logistics and storage department. Just like any kind of business. And your business is probably pretty much like that too. As I said, they've been there for 75 years. Old building. Had about 5,000 square feet. Because the building was old and dilapidated, they're only charging $1.50 a foot. The shopping center across the street, Jackson Square, was $25 a square foot. So just do the math. 5,000 square feet at $25 a square foot on 200,000 revenue means you're paying about 60% of your revenue in rent. So you couldn't move across the street. We looked at the profit and loss statement. And I've simplified it just to give you a quick view, but if you took the cost of goods, about 38%, wage costs, and you can read that. Now, she left school as a school teacher, making about $12,000 a year back in those days. So you can see she took a raise when she bought the business, plus the profit. So she went from making $12,000 to making about $28,000, which was pretty cool. She thought that was pretty neat. But you know, the day came when the bank called and said, well, Marie, you're going to have to move your business. We're going to tear that building down, and we want to do it in 6 or 8 months. And let us know what you want to do. So she had 3 choices. Pretty simple. That's the way she looked. And she was pretty distressed about it. And unbeknownst to me, she went out for lunch. She called formed her own advisor group. And she called in her accountant and her lawyer, 2 suppliers, the old owner of the business, and another florist from Toronto that was friends with her. And they went out for soup and sandwiches. And at the end of the 3 hours they were together, the old florist she bought the business from, she said, I don't know what your problem is, Marie, just buy another flower shop. And Marie looked, what do you mean? Well, then move your business on top of that business. Oh. Interesting. Yeah, maybe lease a small area in the mall, 200 or 300 square feet to maintain your mall presence. You see, one of the things that was really interesting about the flower business, that over 85% of their sales came in on the telephone. So the location really wasn't quite as important as you might think. Yes, it was there forever. It was downtown presence. It was a key. You drive down the street, you drive down King Street, you'd see the flower shop. It was always well decorated, well lit up. At nighttime, it looked like $1 million, but all the business came in on the telephone. Wasn't that interesting? A few months later, a couple with a similar well-established shop decided to retire. They were about a mile away. Now, they owned the building they were operating from. So Marie implemented the plan from the advisor group and bought both the business and the building. And she really had to stretch. In fact, she had to go to Dougie Bank to help put part of the deal together because it stretched our capacity right to the limit at that point in time. So now she had both stores, and she closed she had both businesses. She closed the store at King and James, and she rented a small kiosk in the shopping center. But the lease problem was solved. However, there's some interesting benefits started to stick their head up. Her labor costs went down. Her product costs went down. Advertising became a lower percentage of total sales. Administration costs dropped to a lower percentage of total sales. And she got an increase in profit. And so when we look at her P&L statement, for simplicity, we simply doubled it to show you from $200,000 to $400,000. So the cost of goods dropped by 4 percentage points. Because in the flower business, you bought a bunch of roses. If you didn't sell them, you threw them away. If you got a higher volume, you're going to turn your product more regularly. And she was running turns of like 35% a year, or 35 turns a year. So before, her turns weren't that high, and she was throwing product away. Now she was consuming it all. Her staff was more productive, so the wage costs went down a little bit. She took a raise. As a percentage of sales, it was less, but she took an $8,000 raise. Occupancy costs doubled, because now she's paying mortgage on the new building, and she's paying some rent to the Jackson Square. So the rent remained the same percentage of the total. Advertising went up, but she was lower as a percentage of sales. So she was advertising 2 stores at the same time instead of 1 store twice. Miscellaneous costs dropped a little bit. Anyway, make a long story short, her profits went up 6 times. Wow. When you look at those kind of numbers, you say, oh my God, this is unbelievable. So she sold as she got into it, she started to say, gee, I don't need these delivery vehicles. I use a delivery service. So she talked to delivery people and said, look, I'm going to double the business. Can you give me a better deal? Can you handle it first and double the volume and give us a better price? And they came along, gave her a better price on a per unit delivery cost and said, yes, we can handle it. And they were ecstatic. She sold off the 2 delivery vehicles, put the cash in the bank. Then she reduced the accounts receivable of the purchasers of the business she purchased within a very short period of time, because her management team was far better of collecting receivables than the husband and wife were that retired. That created some extra cash. And they rationalized some hard goods inventory, put about $15,000 into the bank with a few months. So at the end of 6 months, she had $40,000 in the bank, plus the increase in profit. She got her down payment back that she needed to buy both the business and the real estate. That was a pretty neat transaction. She went on and started buying more flower shops. She bought a total of 13 shops by the end of 1990. Revenue in $1990 was $1.6 million. That'd be about probably $8 or $9 million in today's dollars. And she was buying stores and closing them. I remember coming home one night from being down in the States at a conference, and as I pulled into the driveway on Friday night, there were about 8 cars around our house, and I thought, what's going on? And I recognized a couple of vehicles as being people who work for us. Work for her, and they're in the backyard celebrating. That morning, somebody called and said, I've decided to close my business. I'm just going to shut it down. Would you like to buy my inventory? And she knew the florist, and she went in and talked to him, and he was doing about $60,000 a year in sales. It was a 1-person operation with a part-time clerk. She said, I'll buy your inventory if I can have your name and your telephone. She added $50,000 in sales to her business. And she went on, she bought the store in 5 operating stores that she kept and operated, including one in Brantford, Stony Creek, a couple more in Hamilton, another shopping center, and a lot of the other stores she bought, she'd run it for 2-3 months and close them down and merge them in their operation. So there's a really good example in a small scale of how acquisitions can really work for you. So, if anybody's got some questions, I'm happy to chat about them. One of the things that's really important, you got to understand it takes time to do these things. And if you take the time to make the right decision at the right time for the right reasons. And I think that's really important. Most people are in a hurry to do it. I want to get it done now. And they make wrong decisions at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. So taking your time to do it right is really important. We've got a great team of people at Robbinex. And it's kind of nice to work with competent people. So if you're thinking of passing the torch from one person to another, where you're going to take the torch from somebody else, remember you need to take time to do it right. And as I say, if we can help, give us a call. We look forward to working with you. So I don't know, Mark, if that's helpful or not.
Doug, it's always fantastic.
Well, thank you.
You always have so many tips and so much information. It's really amazing. This is, for those of you that don't know, this is the third of the segments that Doug has been doing in this series. So really great information at all 3 events. And Doug, any other thoughts? Any other comments here? I do have a question here from Rodrigo. How can a small business afford all the fees involved in selling a company? How big should you be? Is there maybe a rule of thumb or anything like that? Whereby
most business brokers charge about 10% of the selling price. So if it's a small business, the realtors will charge 10%. Sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 12, depending on the size of the business. So I don't know how big your business is, but if it's doing $200,000 or $300,000 a year in sales, I'd go to a business broker. Sunbelt business brokers come to mind.
Okay. And I guess with the micro companies, I don't know, like 50,000. There's a CPA firm that I've been speaking with. The guy's about 100,000. Any other kind of suggestion? Like, what is it too small for a broker? Would they call you? What are your suggestions with that one, for example?
Well, they can buy consulting time rather than brokerage time. We often do that as well. It's a good tool. In fact, we got one file right now we're called in on, and I think our fee was $5,000, and we solved a big problem for them, and they're pretty excited. So one of the things also keep in mind, many people think they want to sell their business, and they've got a problem they can't solve. And if they could solve the problem, they wouldn't sell the business. So sometimes we need to take our time and understand what's the reason for the decision to make the sale. And maybe we're thinking of selling it for the wrong reason. We had a chap come to us a bunch of years ago. He was 45 years old. He said, I want to sell my business. My dad and I are partners. The dad was 75 years old. And I said, why do you want to sell? He said, I want to put my dad's affairs in order. Okay. Now, they started the business when the kid was 30. So they were now doing about 12 million in sales, and that was quite profitable. We valued it at about $7 million, I think, at the time. And he said, well, I was hoping to get more than that, but okay, I just want to outsell the business. So we had felt that it was an underlying problem. And so we brought our psychologist in to interview the younger guy, the 45-year-old. You see, because when the business got sold, Dad would get a chunk of cash, but he was getting $250,000 a year to stay at home from the company. So it didn't make any sense why they were selling the business, put Dad's affairs in order. Psychologists come back and say, well, the problem we got here is this guy's burnt out. He's weeks away from a nervous breakdown or a mental breakdown or total. He'll be in a hospital for months. You got to get him out of there. He's got to take a vacation of at least 4 weeks and get away from the business. So when we did our presentation, we brought in the son and his wife and his mother and his father, because in effect, it's a family business. And we said, yeah, we'll take it to market for you after you've taken a 4-week vacation. Well, he go right off the wall. 4 weeks? I can't take 4 weeks. I can't take 4 hours. What do you mean 4 weeks? And he started kind of get a little loud and boisterous. And I said to the psychologist, why does he need to take the vacation? And the psychologist was very blunt. Again, we stated he's very close to nervous breakdown. He needs to have it. So I turned to the father and I said, listen, Dad, I know you started a business with the son. He stepped off the curb and got hit by a bus. He was in the hospital for a couple of months. Could you step in and run the business in an emergency? He said, yeah. So I turned to the wife and said, in an emergency, could you find an island without internet or telephone so you go away for 4 weeks? She said, let me at it. I said, call me when you're done. He called back about 8 weeks later. Said, best thing I ever did. He said, I don't want to sell anymore. And we restructured the business so Dad could retire effectively. And he hired a CEO, a controller, a plant manager. So he was doing the job of 3 people. And that's why he wanted to sell. So when he got reorganized, he didn't want to sell anymore. So anybody who wants to sell, they've got a problem. And we need to understand what the problem is. And maybe there's a better solution than selling. You heard me say earlier, there's 14 alternatives to selling, and there really is lots of alternatives.
Awesome. Excellent. Well, thanks very much, Doug, as always. Great information. And, if somebody wants to reach out to you, visit Robbinex.com.
That'll do it. Robbinex.com. Yep, for sure.
Yeah. And thanks also to your team as well behind the scenes for getting everything set up and everything else. So it's good.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Doug. And for those of you continuing to watch, coming up in a matter of 15 minutes, we have the panel, which is coming in, and don't miss that. There's still a couple of other segments that are happening right now as well. So lots to do. Check out the networking area as well. The networking area is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And then there's also the expo area as well. So lots of great stuff, lots of great content still coming up. We've got about 45 minutes left in today's event. And don't go away, because in 15 minutes, we've got a great panel and you will definitely enjoy things. So thanks very much for being here. And we'll be back in about 15 minutes. Thank you.